June 19, 1945, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The air hung thick, a wet wool blanket. Alona could feel it on her skin, in her lungs. A world away from the dry, dusty heat of a Hungarian summer, she watched the line move, metal tray on metal rail, a sound that had become the metronome of her days. Then she saw it, a square of something yellow, a slab of solidified sunlight, porous like a sponge. It sat next to the pale green beans and a scoop of mashed potatoes. The American guard, a boy with a face as smooth as an egg, sliced another piece from a large pan with a practiced motion. Plop! It landed on the tray of the woman ahead of her. Alona saw Ava's shoulders tighten, a subtle, almost invisible flinch. Then it was her turn. Plop! The yellow brick landed on her tray. It trembled slightly. She moved down the line. The smell was strange, sweet but also dusty like a hayloft. Not the rich, sour, earthy smell of bread, not bread at all. She found a space at a long wooden table next to Ava and Zuzana. The three of them looked down at their trays. Zuzana poked the yellow thing with her fork. It crumbled, breaking into a pile of coarse, damp sand. A soft sound escaped Ava's lips. Not a word, a puff of air. A laugh choked back into a gasp of disbelief. Alona met her eyes. The same thought passed between them, unspoken. This is what they feed the animals. The pigs, maybe the chickens. Kukorikadara, cornmeal. Peasants' meal in the worst of times, a famine food. And these Americans, with their clean uniforms and their trucks overflowing with supplies, served it as if it were bread. Another woman across the table, a nurse from Szeged, caught their glance and smiled a thin, weary smile. The gesture was clear. This is what our conquerors eat. This is the food of the victors. How is that possible? Alona looked from the crumbling yellow pile to the guard standing by the door. He was chewing gum, his jaw working rhythmically. He looked bored, he looked comfortable. He had no idea what this gesture, this offering of yellow cake on a dinner tray, communicated. It was not hospitality, it was not sustenance. It was an insult, so profound because it was so clearly unintentional, an act of cluelessness on an industrial scale. They sat in the humid air of the Indiana mess hall, a handful of the thousands of Hungarian women now classified as prisoners of war, and looked at the cornbread. They didn't touch it. Not yet. From Alona's tray, the perspective widens to encompass the room. The mess hall holds 300 women at a sitting, and they will cycle through this ritual 3 times a day. These are not frontline soldiers. They are nurses, typists, radio operators, administrative assistants, members of the Hungarian Women's Auxiliary Corps. Women swept up in the chaotic retreat of Axis forces across Eastern Europe. Some were captured alongside their units. Others were simply in the wrong hospital or the wrong government building when American or British troops arrived. They had survived the siege of Budapest, the forced marches west, the packed train cars. They had witnessed the total collapse of their world. Then came the shock of the Atlantic crossing, a disorienting voyage into a new reality. Now they were here, in the middle of a continent they had only seen on maps, a place of impossible flatness and staggering abundance. The camp itself was a universe of raw timber and asphalt, identical barracks arranged in perfect, soul-crushing grids. The scale of it was hard for Alona to process. At home, a village was a tight cluster of buildings that grew over centuries. Here, a city for 30,000 prisoners had been built in months. Everything was new, everything was disposable, and everything was plentiful. The women watched the garbage trucks haul away barrels of food scraps, more than a Budapest family might see in a week. They saw the guards casually drink Coca-Cola from glass bottles, then toss the bottles into a crate. This casual, thoughtless consumption was more alienating than any overt hostility. It created a chasm of understanding. Their own lives had been defined by scarcity, by the meticulous art of making things last. A worn dress was mended, not replaced. A stale loaf of bread was repurposed into something else. Waste was a moral failing. Here, waste was just a byproduct of efficiency. The risk was not starvation. The camp rations were, by the letter of the Geneva Convention, adequate. The danger was a different kind of dissolution, a slow erosion of self, brought on by the crushing monotony and the cultural vacuum. They were women who had been defined by their work, their families, their cities. Now they were just numbers on a roster, fed by a system that understood calories but not culture. Their shared language and memories were the only things that held their identities together, and in this context, food was not just fuel, it was a connection to that lost world. The rejection of the cornbread was not about taste, it was an act of self-preservation. The contrast began there on the metal tray. A tale of two breads. On one side, the memory of Hungarian bread, dark, heavy, forged from rye and wheat flour. Its character came from the deep, earthy tang of the sourdough starter, a living thing passed down through generations. Ava could close her eyes and recall the exact weight of a finished loaf in her hands, the satisfying resistance as she sliced through the thick, chewy crust. The crumb was dense, moist, and studded with the sharp, aromatic bite of caraway seeds. It was a bread that demanded effort, both to make and to eat. A single slice could sustain you for hours. It was the anchor of every meal, the symbol of the hearth, the taste of a complex, weary, and resilient history. It was a serious food for serious people. On the other side, the reality of American cornbread, yellow, light. Made from cornmeal, baking powder, sugar, and eggs, it was chemically leavened, rising quickly and artificially. Zuzana, pressing her fork into it, saw how it yielded instantly. It had no structural integrity. The crust was a thin, delicate skin, the crumb a loose confederation of particles, ready to disintegrate. Its primary flavor was a simple, uncomplicated sweetness. It was a side dish, an accessory. American women attached to the camp staff would slather it with butter and drizzle it with honey, treating it like a dessert. The prisoners watched this with a kind of forensic curiosity. This wasn't bread as a staple, it was bread as a confection. The comparison extended beyond the plate. The Hungarian loaf was an artifact of a local economy. Its flour came from a specific mill, its flavor shaped by the water and wild yeasts of a particular place. The cornbread was a product of an industrial system. The cornmeal came from identical sacks, shipped by the trainload from vast, anonymous fields in Iowa or Illinois. It was standardized, predictable, and interchangeable. Every single yellow brick was a perfect copy of the last. One loaf held the memory of a grandmother's hands. The other was the output of a formula, a line item on a quartermaster's logistics sheet. For the women, this difference was not trivial. It was the material evidence of the gulf between their world and this one. A difference measured in grams of sugar, in the presence or absence of gluten, in the cultural weight carried by a single staple food. Three women processed this contrast in three different ways, their observations shaping the collective understanding of their new environment. Alona, who had been a bookkeeper in a textile factory, possessed an analytical mind. She watched everything, collecting data as if her life depended on it. She noted the frequency. Cornbread appeared on the menu 4 times a week. She observed the American cooks in the kitchen, their movements efficient but impersonal. She saw the mechanics of the system. "They are not trying to insult us," she would say quietly to the others. "They are trying to be efficient. This yellow stuff is cheap and it fills the belly. It's a solution to a mathematical problem." Alona's interiority was a ledger of facts. She would estimate the number of prisoners, multiply by the portion size, and try to calculate the sheer tonnage of cornmeal required to sustain the camp. For her, understanding the system was a way to feel a sliver of control, to demystify the forces that governed her existence. Then there was Ava. A former history teacher, she was the group's cultural memory. For her, the cornbread was a deep and personal affront. "Bread is not a mathematical problem," she would counter, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "It is the soul of a people. Our bread tells the story of the Magyars, of the soil, of 100 invasions. It tastes of struggle and survival." Her mind was an archive of sensations, the yeasty perfume of a bakery on Andrassy Avenue, the specific crunch of a seed between her teeth, the way a proper slice of rye could hold the weight of sausage and cheese without buckling. She saw the cornbread not as food, but as a form of cultural erasure. It was a bland, sweet, flimsy substitute for the real thing, just as this camp was a substitute for a real life. Her resistance was passive but total. She would eat the beans, the potatoes, but leave the yellow square untouched, a small, silent protest on her tray. Finally, there was Zuzana. At 22, she was younger, a pragmatist forged by the brutal final years of the war. She had been a nursing student, more concerned with anatomy than with history. She remembered the gnawing hunger of the siege, the desperate search for anything edible. While Ilona analyzed and Ava mourned, Zuzana's internal calculus was simpler. Calories are calories, she thought, watching the older women. Being hungry doesn't honor the dead. She was the first of their small group to eat the cornbread. She did so methodically, without expression. She noted the sweetness, the crumbly texture. It wasn't pleasant, but it was warm and it was filling. Her observations were grounded in the body's immediate needs. She noticed that after eating it, the dull ache in her stomach subsided. While Ava felt a sense of loss, Zuzana felt a flicker of a different reality. This was the food of survival now. Her small act of adaptation was a quiet dissent from the collective mourning of the others. The mechanism that delivered the yellow squares to their trays was a marvel of impersonal logistics. It was a system Ilona gradually pieced together through observation and deduction. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps, the largest and most complex supply organization in human history, was responsible for feeding millions of soldiers and prisoners across the globe. The logic of this system was not culinary, it was mathematical. The first link in the chain was agriculture. America's vast, mechanized farms produced a colossal surplus of corn, a grain far more plentiful and less labor-intensive than wheat, especially in wartime. The second link was policy. The 1929 Geneva Convention dictated that prisoners of war must receive rations comparable to those of the captor nation's depot troops. This was a humanitarian standard, but its implementation was left to national authorities. U.S. Army Regulation 3022-10 translated this into specific caloric and nutritional requirements, but the regulation also allowed for substitution in kind, a bureaucratic phrase that gave camp commandants flexibility based on available supply. This was the critical junction. Confronted with the need to feed tens of thousands of POWs in dozens of camps across the country, the Quartermaster Corps turned to its most abundant resource. Cornmeal was cheap, stable for storage and calorie-dense. It was the perfect raw material for an industrial-scale feeding operation. Ilona watched the supply trucks arrive every Tuesday morning. She saw the standardized sacks of enriched, degerminated yellow cornmeal, each stamped with a lot number and a processing date. There was no local miller, no baker's signature. The sacks were unloaded by male prisoners, German infantrymen who moved with a grim efficiency, and stacked in a vast warehouse. From there, the sacks moved to the camp's central kitchen, a cavernous building where the cornbread was mixed in massive, machine-driven vats. The women could see the process through the large windows. The schematic metaphor that formed in Ilona's mind was that of a factory. The system was the assembly line, the prisoners were the consumers, and the cornbread was the standardized, mass-produced product. It was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum cost, with no variable for cultural preference. The women's laughter and disgust were inputs the system was simply not designed to register. Their perceptions were irrelevant to its function. By understanding this, Ilona felt a strange sense of calm. The cornbread wasn't a malicious act of cultural warfare. It was something far more modern and perhaps more chilling, the logical output of a perfectly rational, perfectly indifferent machine. The theme of abundance without quality reappeared in a different domain, reinforcing the women's sense of cultural dislocation. It was in the brown liquid they were served every morning in thick ceramic mugs, American coffee. For women like Ava, who came of age in the vibrant coffeehouse culture of Budapest, this was another, more subtle form of torture. Hungarian coffee, the Pressicave asterisk, was a ritual. It was a thick, dark, almost viscous extraction of finely ground, darkly roasted beans, forced through with steam pressure. It was served in a tiny porcelain cup, a potent elixir that was sipped slowly, its bitterness savored. A single serving was a concentrated event, a punctuation mark in the day, a catalyst for conversation, intellectual debate, and flirtation. Ava's memory was saturated with the smells of specific cafes, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of a spoon against saucer. It was a taste of sophistication and urbanity. By contrast, the American coffee served in the camp was a thin, watery brew. It was light brown, almost translucent. It was made in enormous percolators, gallons at a time, where hot water passed over coarse grounds again and again, leaching out the caffeine but leaving behind any nuance or depth of flavor. The American guards and staff drank it constantly, from large mugs, as if it were water. They used it as a functional beverage, a simple stimulant to get through the day. There was no ritual, no savoring. It was fuel, just like the cornbread. The prisoners were allotted 1 8-ounce mug with their breakfast. Ava once remarked, with a sad smile, that it would take at least a dozen of these mugs to equal the flavor intensity of a single, proper Hungarian coffee. This secondary contrast sharpened their understanding. It wasn't that Americans didn't have bread or coffee, it was that they had redefined these things. They had stripped them of their ritualistic and sensory dimensions, transforming them into mere delivery systems for calories and caffeine. This relentless utilitarianism was, in its own way, more jarring than outright deprivation. It suggested a world where the pleasures the women had cherished, the dense chew of real bread, the intense jolt of real coffee, were considered inefficient, unnecessary luxuries. The American system provided for the body's basic needs with overwhelming generosity, but it seemed to have no vocabulary for the needs of the soul. This daily encounter with American foodways began to surface a deep ideological clash. The Hungarian women operated on a set of unspoken assumptions about the world. They believed that food was inextricably linked to identity, craft, and love. A well-made meal was a mark of competence and a gesture of care. The thoughtless, industrial nature of the camp's food violated this core belief. It presented a reality that was deeply unsettling, that a nation could achieve global power and immense wealth while being, in their eyes, profoundly ignorant about something as fundamental as a loaf of bread. A quiet friction developed, a tension born of inverted roles. These women, many of whom had managed households, hospital wards, or office kitchens with meticulous skill, were now rendered utterly passive. They were recipients, not agents. A particularly sharp instance of this occurred one afternoon when Alona saw an American GI, a young private assigned to the kitchen, trying to cut a freshly baked sheet of cornbread. He hacked at it with a spatula, and with each clumsy stroke, the warm bread shattered into a cascade of crumbs. Half of it was being reduced to rubble before it even reached the serving line. Standing nearby was a Hungarian woman named Margit, who had run a successful pastry shop in Pest. Alona watched Margit's hands clench at her sides. She saw the woman's body tense with the suppressed urge to snatch the spatula away, to show the boy the proper way to let it cool slightly, to score it cleanly, to use a long, thin knife. The competence was there, coiled and ready, but trapped behind the wire fence of her prisoner status. Margit's internal monologue, as she later recounted to Alona, was not one of anger at the boy, but of frustration at the sheer inefficiency of it all. It was waste. Wasted food, wasted effort, wasted knowledge. This constant, quiet witnessing of incompetence by those with unacknowledged expertise became a major source of psychic strain. The system that held them captive was powerful, but in these small, crucial ways, it seemed inept. It raised a quiet, persistent question in Alona's mind as she lay on her bunk at night. How could they be so good at building tanks and bombers, and so bad at making bread? To legitimize their own understanding of the situation, the women became quiet ethnographers of their own captivity. They pooled their observations, creating a body of evidence from the raw data of their daily lives. Alona's diary was the most formal of these records. In a small notebook she had managed to keep, she logged the menu rotations with the precision of an accountant. Her notes were spare, factual. Week 24, cornbread M, W, TH, sat, white bread T, F, sun. Potatoes boiled 7 days, green beans canned 5 days. These simple lists were more than a record of meals. They were a chronicle of monotony, a mathematical proof of the system's repetitive logic. The numbers provided a kind of scaffolding for their shared experience. Another woman, who had worked as a clerk in a ministry, had a sharp eye for bureaucracy. It was she who first paid close attention to the camp regulations posted on a bulletin board. She painstakingly translated the English text, explaining the significance of the guaranteed 2,000 calories per day under the Geneva Convention. This fact, filtered through her interpretation, was crucial. It confirmed Alona's theory. This was about compliance, not comfort. The camp administration was fulfilling its legal obligation to the letter. This knowledge didn't make the cornbread taste any better, but it removed the suspicion of deliberate cruelty. It replaced a narrative of personal malice with a more daunting one of impersonal procedure. Zuzana, the pragmatist, latched onto this. For her, the 2,000-calorie figure became an anchor. It was a tangible promise, a guarantee of survival, and she began to see the cornbread as a concrete portion of that guarantee. Their collective evidence-gathering extended to logistics. From their barracks, they could see the main supply road. They noted the frequency of the trucks, the logos on the sides, the nature of the cargo they could glimpse. Sacks of flour, crates of canned goods, barrels of what they assumed was lard. They pieced together a mental map of the camp's supply chain, deducing that their diet was determined far away, in warehouses and procurement offices. Their evidence pack was not a weapon of resistance, but a tool of comprehension. It allowed them to diagnose their condition, to understand the nature of the system that enclosed them. By observing, recording, and analyzing, they transformed their passive experience into an active, intellectual project. It was a way of reclaiming a small measure of agency in a world designed to strip it from them. The initial laughter had long since faded. The intellectual curiosity had given way to a deep somatic weariness. The cumulative effect of the alien diet began to land in their bodies. It wasn't the acute agony of starvation, which many of them had known, but a chronic, low-grade malaise, a profound, gnawing hunger that calories alone could not satisfy. The constant sweetness of the food, the sugar in the cornbread, the ketchup served with everything, the jam at breakfast, became cloying. Ava complained of a perpetual sourness in her stomach. She felt a constant fatigue, a heaviness in her limbs that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Her body, conditioned by a lifetime of sour rye and fermented vegetables, seemed to be quietly rejecting this new fuel. The psychological cost was even greater. The daily appearance of the cornbread on the tray became a relentless symbol of their captivity. It was a yellow, crumbly reminder of their displacement, their powerlessness, their loss. Each meal was a fresh confrontation with the vast distance between who they had been and what they had become. The disdain hardened into a quiet, depressive resignation. They were eating, but they were not being nourished. The emotional peak of this period was not loud or dramatic. It was a moment of profound, shared silence. One night, long after lights out, Alona was awakened by a faint sound. In the bunk across the narrow aisle, Ava was crying. It was a silent weeping, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. Alona could see her in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Ava was clutching a small, embroidered linen sachet to her face, inhaling its scent. Alona knew what was in it. A handful of caraway seeds, brought all the way from her kitchen in Budapest. The ghost of the bread she could no longer have. Alona rose and went to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The scent of caraway in the dark, humid barracks was an olfactory cry, a desperate summons for a world that no longer existed. In that moment, the entire weight of their collective loss seemed to be concentrated in that small, fragrant pouch. It was a breaking point, a quiet nadir of morale from which something had to change. The change came with the weather. In early December, a massive ice storm swept across the Midwest. It coated everything in a thick, clear sheath of ice. Power lines snapped under the weight. Roads became impassable. For 3 days, Camp Atterbury was cut off from the outside world. The constant rumble of supply trucks ceased. A new kind of quiet fell over the camp, punctuated by the sharp crack of freezing tree branches. The administration immediately implemented emergency protocols. Rations were cut. The portions of meat and canned vegetables shrank. The already watery coffee became little more than colored hot water. A new, sharper anxiety rippled through the barracks, the familiar fear of genuine scarcity. But one thing remained constant. In the chaotic, stripped-down emergency kitchens, the American cooks, working by lantern light, continued to bake cornbread. The yellow squares, perhaps a little smaller than before, still appeared on the trays. It was the one food item for which the camp had a massive, secure surplus. It was the bedrock of the entire nutritional system. It was on the second day of the lockdown that the revelation occurred, crystallizing in Alona's mind as she sat staring at her tray. The cornbread was never meant to be bread. It was fuel. This simple, one-sentence insight reconfigured everything. It was like a key turning in a lock. The first implication was that all their prior comparisons were invalid. They had been judging the cornbread against the standards of a Hungarian bakery, a battle it was always destined to lose. But that was the wrong frame. It wasn't a failed attempt at bread. It was a highly successful, purpose-built caloric delivery system. It was engineered to be produced in vast quantities, with maximum efficiency, from the cheapest available ingredients, to keep a captive population alive. It was the edible equivalent of a K-ration or a block of ammunition. The second implication followed immediately. With this new understanding, the emotional charge began to drain away. The cornbread was no longer a cultural insult. It was a piece of technology. Alona looked at the yellow brick on her tray, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something like respect. A cold, analytical respect for its brutal functionality. It did its job. On that third day, as the hunger deepened and the cold seeped into the barracks, Zuzana took a bite of her portion, and something was different. It no longer tasted of loss or displacement. It tasted warm. It was solid. It was energy, it tasted like survival. The journey from laughter to acceptance was a microcosm of a larger process of adaptation. The initial cause, the U.S. Army's reliance on a logistical system prioritizing efficiency and cost-effectiveness, produced an immediate effect: the introduction of a food that was nutritionally sound but culturally alien. For the Hungarian women, this clash between their cultural expectations of food and the reality of the camp rations created a crisis of morale, a period of psychological rejection and despair. Their eventual adaptation was not a simple matter of acquiring a new taste. It was a profound cognitive shift. The revelation that cornbread was fuel, not bread, allowed them to step outside their own cultural framework and analyze their situation from the perspective of the system that controlled them. This shift from a cultural to a strategic framework was the key to their psychological survival. It illustrates a durable takeaway about power and identity. Systems of control, even those that are not intentionally cruel, often work by imposing a monolithic, impersonal logic onto the diverse, nuanced lives of individuals. The friction arises when the system's definition of a basic need, like food, is radically different from the individual's. For the women, bread meant community, history, and sensory pleasure. For the Quartermaster Corps, bread meant a shelf-stable unit of carbohydrates. The women's story demonstrates that resilience in such a system does not always mean holding onto old definitions. Sometimes, it means learning the new language of power in order to navigate it. They didn't learn to love cornbread. They learned to understand its purpose, and in doing so, they found a way to make it serve their own purpose: endurance. Their journey shows that meaning is not inherent in an object, but is constructed through interpretation. The yellow brick on the tray was, at various times, a joke, an insult, a symbol of loss, and finally, a tool for survival. The object never changed, but its meaning was utterly transformed. We return to the image from the beginning: a metal tray, a square of yellow cornbread. Alona looks at it, but her gaze is no longer one of disdain or confusion. It is clear, steady, and analytical. As the view pulls back, we see the entire mess hall filled with hundreds of women, and on every tray sits the identical yellow square. The scene is the same, but the internal reality has been remade. The act of lifting the fork, of breaking apart the crumbly brick, is no longer a gesture of defeat. It has become a conscious, strategic act of self-preservation, a quiet transaction for the calories needed to survive another day. Their initial laughter was a shield, a way to resist a reality they couldn't comprehend. Their eventual, quiet acceptance was a key, a way to unlock the logic of their new world and find a way to endure it. What we often dismiss as a simple meal can be a complex negotiation of identity, power, and survival. Notice what changes when we stop judging something by what we think it should be, and start asking what it was designed to do. If this exploration of how meaning is found in the most unexpected places has sparked your curiosity, subscribe for our next chapter. We journey into the soundproofed rooms of a Cold War listening post to understand the world through the ears of the women who learned to find signals in the silence.